Hello, welcome to my project on John Stuart Mill. So the quote I picked is kind of just the basis of the whole book, which is the harm principle. It's on page 597. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. So what he's saying with this is that government especially can't be exercising control over people unless there's harm in the mix. So unless you're not harming other people, the government shouldn't be controlling what you're doing. So let's see how that kind of plays out in the book itself. So in the first chapter, he introduces us to the harm principle by talking about this historic tension between liberty and authority in government, and that recently people have been solving this tension through the tyranny of the majority. But Mill says that this still harms individual liberty, the tyranny of the majority. So his solution is the harm principle, which isn't dependent on the majority or whoever's in government. It's simply a principle that the government has to be held to. The second chapter, he talks about the harm principle allows for liberty of thought to flourish unrestricted. And this is important because liberty of thought is what is supposed to move our society forward and helps us to reach actual truth. So the harm principle helps in that liberty of thought and sort of progressing us forward. Book 3 or chapter 3 is about how the harm principle, well, it protects individuality, which Mill claims is key to human development. So the harm principle can help with human development in that way by fostering individuality. In chapter 4, he explains the harm principle kind of even more in focus. And he says that there are two things that society may enforce at all costs. The first is not injuring others' interests or rights, and that's outlined by the law. And the second is being willing to defend society and its members from injury. This is the chapter where he has these examples about Muslim countries, the Spaniards, Puritans, and Mormons. Those come into play as examples of the harm principle not being used and how that has harmed, like, individual liberty is being harmed right now, and the harm principle can solve for that by restricting the government abuse. So that leads to the last chapter, which is kind of a summary and further discussion of what he thinks. And basically, whenever we can, we should try to preserve liberty rather than call on state action. And we do this by way of the harm principle. So just focusing on only restricting people if they're harming others. With that, let's talk about some of the implications of the harm principle. So a state doesn't have a right to create laws that make us better or good, just laws that restrict us from harming others. And so he says that all errors which he is likely to commit against advice and warning are far away by the evil, allowing others to constrain him to what they deem is his good. So the government can't tell you what's good and make you do it. And so one of the examples he talks about in chapter 4 is the Spaniards outlawing non-Catholic worship, and that's sort of the Spaniards telling people what's good, which wouldn't be allowed by the harm principle. We would have more liberty to let people do what they deem to be good. If they're not harming others, then it shouldn't be a problem. And so one thing is, how does that jive with his thoughts on required education? He actually does think that education should be required by the state, because if you don't educate, children, it's actually a harm to them. But then you ask yourself, where is the line between wrongly enforcing good and rightly rescuing people from harm? So the Spaniards would imagine that the Catholic faith is like a necessary thing that's good, in maybe the way that education is good. So it seems like requiring things, or what's harmful and what's not harmful, is kind of contextual, because not educating someone isn't actively violently harming them, but he seems to imply that there's a sort of a developmental harm, an emotional harm, but couldn't other people claim the same thing about, the Catholic religion or the Puritans with their restriction of sort of entertainment? Couldn't they claim similar things that they're saving people from harm, whatnot? And so it kind of seems with the education thing, unsure. The other thing with the harm principle is that inactivity counts as harm too, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but if a person causes evil to others not only by the actions he takes, but by inaction, and that holds you accountable for that action. So if a father neglects a child, that's inaction. And basically, if there's something you can act on, if you don't act and someone's harmed, then you're accountable. And so with this wider view of liberty, he ends up advocating for like a marketplace of ideas, leading us to truth, and free trade capitalism is protecting consumers from government abuse and government restrictions. And those sort of just come from the harm principle, widening that idea of liberty forward, because the only thing the government should really be focusing on is decreasing harm rather than trying to control what's good or bad. So the questions I have here is, does the harm principle embody an ideal form of government? He doesn't really mandate any particular form of government. So he doesn't say it should be a democracy, it should be this, it should be that. It's sort of like, as long as you can follow this principle and maintain liberty, then you pass the test. And he seems to have different ideas about different types of government, but nothing that he's really mandating governments to do. So is this the right thing? Is the government's role simply to like stop harm happening to its citizens, or is there roles beyond that? We talked about inaction. So should inaction make you accountable for someone else being harmed? In the example of like parent neglect, that makes sense to us, I think, in a lot of ways. But if you just kind of observe a harmful situation from a distance or whatever, and you don't get involved even though you could have, does that mean that the responsibility is on you for that harm that played out? Should you be legally held accountable for the harm that's caused if you simply witness a situation that you could have stopped? What does the inaction mean? The next question is, should states abandon the cultural laws that inhibit liberty? And Mill says, yeah, because one example he gives is the Mormons. So the US had laws against, or continues to have laws against polygamy. And is it legitimate for them to do that under the harm principle? Mill says no, and that polygamy, if it isn't harming them, the Mormons should be able to do that in the US. Even though he doesn't agree with a lot of like the Mormons' religion, he seems to have this idea of people should be able to be free to be individuals to do that. And he is really against the idea of custom because he thinks it constrains individual liberty. So this kind of goes directly against Burke in that he thinks that liberty is key to a stable society, whereas Mill is bashing on this idea of custom as harm to individual liberty. So how do we balance these things? How do we balance tradition and holding on to the past versus liberty, what's going on right now, and trying to uphold being an individual rather than just following in footsteps? How do we progress forward if we don't sort of reevaluate these traditions and laws? And that's kind of something that the harm principle doesn't really think about culture. It is just about whether people are being harmed or not. And so it can allow for kind of different things in society to change a lot. And so should we abandon all these laws, or how should we go about that? The last kind of a question I have is kind of how you guys have reacted to coronavirus, the relevancy of individual liberty versus harm to others today. So this situation that we're going through, especially with the discussion of like stay-at-home orders and wearing masks in public and all this stuff. If the government should enforce this or not has sort of been up for debate. So what we're seeing here is a lot of people claim that this is our liberty, our individual rights to be able to kind of do as we please, even if it speeds up the coronavirus, or is this really a harm to others? So what Mill would probably talk about here is sort of when we go out in public and we don't stay home, it is actively harming others by allowing the virus to propagate. But on the other side of it, you could say that you're not harming others, because if you go out and you don't ever get the virus, it's not a problem. Or if you go out and get the virus, you could just quarantine and you wouldn't be harming others. But then you're kind of playing a probability game. But as we can see here, this sort of liberty, you can do what you want, unrestricted, do as you desire, versus harming others is very clear in this case, where we're not really sure how much we should see our friends, how much we should go to stores, travel around. People over spring break going to Florida seem to be breaking this harm principle and are harming others. So we're seeing that this is happening as we speak, and these philosophers are still relevant. And that's about all I got for you guys. So some things to think about. Thanks.